Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we're going to talk about compatibility. And we're specifically going to talk about, do opposites attract? So I wanted to start by looking into where this phrase originated. And maybe you know more about it than I do, Mark, but the only thing I could find was this guy named Robert Francis Winch, who studied spouses in the 1950s and found that people are looking for characteristics that they lack. So
I have never heard of that or
really?
him.
Okay.
I was thinking when I read the outline, people are looking for characteristics they lack. I don't believe that. I don't.
Oh, okay.
See, if you think like Helen Fisher,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I've mentioned her before, she's an anthropologist, and her specialty is what attracts people. She's the one who Match.com wanted to do a sister site, and they called it Chemistry.com.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
They charged more money for it, and they got Helen Fisher to be the one to design it. And I heard her talk about it one time. She believes that the very first thing that attracts us, what do you think it is?
Looks.
She's in favor of, so she was talking about the site, like, what are some of those dating sites? I don't know what they are, but where, you're just swiping through pictures.
Yeah, I think like Tinder or something
whatever
like that.
And she's a real advocate for them.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason she stated is because it really speeds up the process. Because the very first thing you're attracted to is look. I think that attraction. So this guy back in the 1950s, I would guess that the research and people looking into this has come a long way from the 1950s.
Yeah.
And that it's very complex. And so you have looks, and then you have, say, if we go to Robert Sapolsky, and that we don't have any free will, and that what is guiding us is hormones, smells, things like that.
Right.
There's been some research that talks. Now they use the term pheromones, but pheromones is really an inaccurate term as applied to human beings, is my understanding, because it's really an insect thing. But I think people use it kind of as a general catch-all to talk about smells. There's a guy in Tel Aviv at the Weizmann Institute who that's all he does, studies olfaction. And they did some work on partners, long-term partners, and can you smell your long-term, like on a T-shirt, and can you pick up the smell of a long-term partner? And a lot of people think that what the other thing that attracts us is smell. And then I have run into couples who, like they say, interestingly, they're married, but they go back to what they didn't like about the person, and they might say he was a terrible kisser. And so that, I think, for me, falls into that realm of physical attractiveness. And so there are all these things that attract us. And so maybe later on, we might think about what it is that we like about the other person. And so I can't say, no, it doesn't work, that opposites attract. But it's just when you look at couples, sometimes they're opposite, sometimes they're not. I don't know that there's any pattern that you could point to that says this is the way this works.
I really think that relationship success in general, like whether or not a couple is going to be compatible, I think it has way more to do with your dedication and your commitment.
Well, that's absolutely true. I mentioned the guy, I can't remember his name, out of the University of Denver. That's all he did was study commitment, I think it was commitment, and that's what he thinks. That, for instance, it's not about marriage. It's not about the ceremony. You can live together. And if you are committed to people, to each other in the same way that you might be when you get married, then your chances of staying together are just as good. So you're right. It's about commitment. But I think that what a lot of couples don't do is in that dating period before they commit, before they get married, that they ignore red flags often.
Yeah.
Now, some of those red flags, well, I think often they're incompatibility,
Right.
whatever that's going to be. And, that doesn't, you can have that incompatibility and you can still love each other.
Hmm.
And you might still be able to have a strong physical attraction. And so I think a lot of people misunderstand that and they get confused by it because, that physical attraction is strong and the passion is strong, but there are some really basic incompatibilities that aren't going to work long term. Now that doesn't, I think people can be very different and opposite and still have good relationships. And I think that in a lot of ways that that can be pretty healthy because you each bring different things into the relationship. But I can say just as easily that if you're very similar, then I think the same thing applies.
Yeah.
That you can have a good relationship and you're going to be similar. And I've said so many times it's not about love; it's always about behavior.
Yep.
And so if you get into a relationship, say you're opposite on something,
Hmm.
and you expect that your partner's going to change, then
Yeah.
that is a huge
It.
mistake
Yeah,
that a
it
lot of
is.
people make, and they think, "Oh, I can live with this." Here's the other thing: a lot of characteristics you can think, "Oh, I can live with that," until you have children,
Yeah.
and you don't think about that in those early stages.
So a good example could be, me and Curtis, just in terms of where we're very different. I'm an extrovert and he's an introvert.
Hmm.
And we still work together very well. And the main reason being is because he doesn't hold me back, or I guess we're respectful of each other's needs, right?
Yeah,
So I understand that he doesn't want to just spend forever at a social event. Like he can only handle so much of a social event before it's like, okay, he's wore out, he's ready to go. And on the same token, he doesn't hold me back, or he understands that I need those social events, and so he will go, or he'll just let me go by myself. And he's always up for, if I want to just go have a girls' night and just go hang out with girlfriends, he's all for it. He encourages that because he understands that that is good for me.
and so I think you bring up a really interesting point as far as introversion and extroversion. So Lindy and I are the same way. I'm pretty much an introvert. She's an
Hmm.
extrovert. But I think in that case, it might be that unconsciously the person is attracted to that opposite feature, in the other person because it's something they don't have, and that's somewhat attractive to be able. Let's say I'm the introvert and I'm attracted to someone who's an extrovert. That's
Yeah.
fairly attractive to be able to have someone who might pull you out of your shell a little bit. But I think the
Hmm.
opposite can also be true that the extrovert can be attracted to the introvert because they're generally quiet, they have a calmer lifestyle, and that to have that in your life can be helpful and effective too. But I think you're right. The way it works is by accepting that you're different,
Hmm.
and then by allowing each other to do what you need to do. Like for an introvert to pull in and recharge by being alone, not in a
Yeah.
big group, and for an extrovert to recharge by being out there in a big group. Adrian and Jake are the same way too. She's very
Yeah.
much an extrovert. He's more of an introvert.
Hmm. And and so it works. So another thing that I want to circle back to that you said, and that's in terms of physical attraction.
Hmm.
And people always say that you shouldn't, that looks shouldn't matter, but I don't think that's true. I mean, I think to an extent, now looks should not be the primary reason, but I think it is important to be physically attracted to your partner. I think that does matter. And it's okay that some people might be attracted to you and some people might be unattractive to you. I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think you can still appreciate somebody, be nice and be kind to them, even if you're not attracted to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so if we pull this apart just a little bit, because
Hmm.
I think, as I said earlier, the first thing that attracts you is going to be the way a person looks.
Yeah.
Now, to me, so if you meet someone and there's this attraction and you can feel it, because usually you know what that is and you can feel it. I think that's different than, say, a person thinking, I am going to go after and only date people who might have
Mm,
these physical qualities. See, to
yeah.
me, that's very different. And I think
Hmm.
that's a mistake that,
Yeah.
that they're making because it's not that they are attracted to the person. They're looking for someone with specific characteristics that they may or may not be attracted to, because it's complex and it's not
Yeah.
just looks in the end. It's certainly behavior. I think there's good evidence for smell also, which is just probably more hormones. Did I tell you about, I think I've mentioned this study. It was a really interesting study that, and I'm gonna goof this up just so our listeners know, because it's been a long time since
Mm-hmm.
I've done it. But they it happened down in Texas, and what they did is they took men and they made them wear a T-shirt,
Mm-hmm.
and for like 10 days without taking it off, so it really
Okay.
got their body smells. And they
Mm-hmm.
put them into a plastic, a bag, and filled them up. And these men were not partnered. And then they took women who weren't partnered either, and they asked them to smell and then rank them
Okay.
and rank the smell, attractive or not attractive. And then what they did is they took and I think it might be DNA that they're looking at from both
Mm-hmm.
partners. And, the idea that variation in partners' DNA, is really healthy for the species and for offspring. And what
Mm-hmm.
they found is the people who were attracted to each other had those characteristics that would make for really great offspring. And
Interesting.
so I'm changing it just slightly, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
And so what what it was is they were attracted by the smell, but somehow the smell was telling them something.
Mm.
So I can't remember this guy's name from the Weizmann Institute in Tel Aviv, but this is going to be a gross reference. But you know how dogs smell each other, right?
Yeah. 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 They smell the anus.
People do too, not but people smell each other. So if
Okay.
you, so they've looked at this. If you shake someone's hand,
Mm-hmm.
within about 30 seconds, you will take your hand and put it close to your face.
Really?
Yeah. And he says we are constantly, often throughout the day, smelling ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so smell gives us a lot of this information that we are unaware of. And it also gives us information about the other person we're unaware of. And it's
Interesting.
really fascinating.
And you can also have a successful, happy relationship if there doesn't have to be this wild physical attraction to begin with. Like it doesn't have to be, love at first sight, right?
Well, okay. So here's something that's interesting. So when I did my dissertation,
Mm-hmm.
now it's true I was looking at gay male couples
Mm-hmm.
and the characteristics of long-term gay male couples. But interestingly, they're very similar to long-term straight couples.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the couples who were successful in long-term being over 5 years together, all of the couples who were successful talked about that initial passion.
So,
And
right.
and so that initial passion turns out to be pretty important. And the reason it's important is, so I run into couples all the time who get married and don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And then 5 years in or 10 years in, they're wanting that. They're trying to figure out why they don't have it. And
Right.
and and I've never seen a couple be able to go back and get it.
So what I'm talking about is just like initial physical attraction, not passion, right? Like you
Okay.
don't like I'm talking about so I mean, for example, when Curtis and I first met, neither one of us looked at the other one's like, wow, that person is
Hmm.
just like that their looks are
Okay.
just amazing. Right. So I mean, but as we got to know each other and as we began, just talking and hanging out, that attraction developed.
Right.
And
Okay.
and
You're
obvious
right. I agree with that.
okay, yeah. I think that yes, there does I think you do need to eventually develop a physical attraction, which
Right.
obviously we did. But just because it doesn't start off, from the get-go, just because there doesn't have to be this, oh, our eyes meet across the room and it's like this instant connection.
Yeah.
That doesn't have to happen to have
No.
a happy relationship. So here is something else that I thought of that I think would be interesting to talk about. And that is this idea of when we are seeking people to date, the idea that we seek somebody who is alike our mother or father in some way.
Well, okay. It's a little more complex than that.
Okay.
So this idea, to my knowledge, comes from Harville Hendricks and Helen LaKelly Hunt, who's his wife. And their type of therapy is called imago therapy. So he believes this happens in every marriage. I don't know that anything happens in every marriage, but it
Sure.
often happens that we are unconsciously attracted to someone who replays the family of origin issues. So
Mm.
it's not quite that, I would be attracted to someone who reminds me of my mother. It could be I might be unconsciously attracted to someone who has the qualities of my father as well. Or it
Right.
could, yeah, it could be another primary caregiver as well. But the idea is, from his perspective, is that what we're after is to have that. He calls it the original childhood wound, whatever it might be,
Okay.
and that we are unconsciously attracted to someone who's going to replay that original childhood wound. And I actually see this all the time in my
Mm.
office with
Okay.
couples, very, very often, that you can go back and you can and pull that apart and help the couple see it. Now, here's the unconscious desire is that the partner you're with will suddenly wake up one morning and resolve that original childhood wound,
Mm-hmm.
and say if you didn't get the love from your mother that you needed, and all of a sudden your partner wakes up and, gives you that love and solves it. That doesn't happen.
Right.
That's a mistake that people make. And that whatever it is that you're lacking and that you're trying to find unconsciously through your partner, you need to get that internally through yourself.
Mm.
And so that when we work on it with couples in my office, that's where we go to, is when you have to point out what's going on. That doesn't mean, when you point it out, doesn't mean that they aren't going to have a successful relationship. It's
Mm-hmm.
just that you need to be aware. The insight is important. And then you need to be aware of, okay, what do you need to do in order to get that internal healing, is what I would call it.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we will be right back.
Hey guys, it's Joel from Momentous Experience here. How you going? If you listen to people that I catch up with here and around the world, talking about their mental health, the challenges they face, and how they've managed it. It's all about spreading awareness and promoting a peaceful and balanced life. So join me again, Momentous Experience, on Spotify, Apple, and Google.
Yeah, and and that makes sense. I mean, and so I'm comparing this to, I guess my own childhood and my own relationship. And, I mean, I can definitely see where a lot of the insecurities that I had as a child carried in over to, or some of my, I guess childhood baggage, which
Uh-huh.
is something that everybody has, by the way. So
Right,
parents,
right.
please don't
Yes.
guilt yourselves over ruining your child, because absolutely everyone anywhere on the face of the planet is going to have some sort of childhood something that they're going
Yes.
to carry
Yep.
into a relationship, because
Yep.
we're human beings. And I definitely been able to see that and kind of see even a little bit how Curtis maybe fulfills a little bit of that role, but see at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, I don't know, because there's some ways where Curtis is similar to my dad, but I think in more ways he's a lot different
Mm-hmm.
than my dad.
Well, as I said, Hendricks would say it happens all the time, and I would say it happens sometimes.
Yeah, because I mean, I can definitely see the similarities between my dad and Curtis in some respect, but it's more of like little quirky things. Like they both love corny jokes,
Yeah.
right? Which, and they both love technology, and they both like to
Mm-hmm.
have, they both like nice things, right? And
Yeah.
like having nice things. But I mean, that can be true for any myriad of things. I don't know if I'm somehow subconsciously attracted to those specific traits,
Oh,
but
that's not what Hendricks is talking
yeah,
about.
yeah,
Here's another one of his favorite sayings. Nobody gets out of childhood unscathed.
yep,
So
yeah,
I think that's true.
yeah. I mean, my kids have, I would say, a fairly low stress environment. I mean, they have all their needs met. They don't have any major stresses in their life. Well, I don't know, maybe they do because they have a brother who's got a lot of medical issues. So, I
Right.
mean, again, but that's nothing that we can control. And so
No.
even someone who can have a seemingly perfect childhood, there's just no such thing, because everybody has something. And even if we didn't have these medical issues, my kids are still going to grow up with something that's going to make them neurotic in some way.
Right.
Because
we all have.
Because we're all just human beings.
All right, kids. It's what keeps us in business.
Yes, exactly. All right. So let's get into what we promised listeners last time, and that is Taylor Swift and Travis Kelsey. Let's get into it.
So you're going to probably know more about this than I. As I understand it, he is very different than her previous boyfriend.
See,
do you know that? Or
I mean,
the way I've heard it is he's let's just say he's more masculine.
Okay. See, I don't know that much about her previous boyfriends other than that they were famous. Like Harry Styles. I know that
so
I know he was a band. He was in a band, and that's about it.
Okay, but if you look at Harry Styles and Travis Kelsey, if you look at their pictures, they're about as polar opposite as you could get.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think that for whatever reason, she has chosen someone who's very different than her previous relationship.
And so has he, because my understanding is that before Taylor Swift, the only girls he dated were black girls. And he is.
Okay. And I don't know anything about him, so I don't know that.
And honestly, in terms of compatibility, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it's way too early to tell. They've been dating for what, less than a year now?
Right. You can't really tell, but boy, does everybody want to analyze that relationship.
People do. I mean, and I think it is interesting that they are dating people who are just so different. And, they seem to be happy, but they also tend to be a little more, I think they also tend to keep the relationship a little more private, right? I mean, it's not like they're the Kardashians.
Is good for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think I have heard, I don't know. I think I've heard a statistic or maybe not a statistic, but I think I've just kind of heard from just various celebrities that couples whose relationship or who put their relationship out in the public eye too much, it's not good. And I can't imagine it being good.
Yeah, I don't know that would go well. I think you need that privacy to get to know each other well. And so as far as I can tell, they do a pretty good job of trying to keep it private. They aren't going to be successful all the time, certainly, but they can certainly try. So it is an interesting the thing I saw today. I have this bad habit of reading headlines and not stories, so I only get the gist. He said he has no idea how he used profanity, so I won't. But he says he has no idea how he ever caught her eye.
Huh. Okay.
How that ever happened. I think he's the one who reached out to her, though.
Okay.
I think in the storyline.
I don't even know.
Yeah. And so, so that is a case of they're very opposite each other, I think. But I think that the benefit, let's talk about the benefits of opposite. I think it can bring out qualities in the other person that might be difficult to bring out on their own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the benefits of doing that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So, I had a very serious relationship in high school that lasted about a year and a half. And, we were very opposite, very, very opposite. I was I'm extremely extroverted and he was extremely introverted, almost painfully shy. Mm-hmm. Right. And, and I definitely brought out this whole new side. A lot of people was like, I had no idea that this side of him even existed. I really kind of brought him out of his shell. Now, the other issue with that, though, is when I brought him out of his shell, it was almost like he couldn't exist without me outside of that shell. And so he was very smothering. And I didn't realize it until after we broke up. I was like, holy cow, was this guy a burden?
Well, you were his safety net.
I very, very much was. But in
outside world.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I think is important, if you go back to Taylor Swift and Travis Kelsey, that opposites work, I think you have to be open to different experiences as well.
Yeah.
Because if you're opposite in any ways and you get into the relationship and you expect the other person to bend to be like you, then it's
Yeah.
not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're both willing, say, to meet somewhere in the middle and experience each other's world, that's when I think it really works. Because then what you're doing is you're not constricting each other, you're enhancing each other's world.
Yes. And that was another big problem with that relationship is I tried to push him too much into religion because religion was such a big part of my life. And because he was willing to make it a small part of his life, but I tried to push him too hard and it wasn't good on my part, right?
Right.
But again, it's an example of where it didn't work. But at the same time, I think that in terms of compatibility and where if you do have opposites, and where it's not going to be compatible is you talked about those red flags in terms of compatibility, and something that I want to say about red flags that we've never talked about before, and we've talked about red flags in relationships a number of times. I don't know that you are ever going to find somebody who doesn't have some type of red flag. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true. And so, what I say to people is it's not, oh, if there's a red flag in the relationship.
Yeah.
I say if there's a red flag, don't ignore it.
Yeah.
I think it's a mistake to ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this ties into going back to opposites.
Yeah.
That if you get in a relationship and you're opposite in some way, you cannot expect the other person to change.
Mm-hmm.
That's a mistake. You have to accept them for who they are and where they are.
Yeah.
And if you can't, then the relationship won't.
Okay, let's take a quick break and we will be right back.
Hi, Denise Hamilton-Mace here, host of the Low No Drinker podcast, your place to go to meet the people and brands leading the low and no alcohol revolution. Every week, I speak to brand founders like Carl Anthony Brown from CrossFit Non-Alcoholic Spirits and ex-MasterChef finalist Billy Wright from Descent 10% Gin. Industry experts like Hamish Renton in our chat about how the fat jabs will impact low and no drinkers. And I help you answer questions like what the heck is the difference between non-alcoholic and alcohol-free anyways. This podcast is for you if you're looking for a fun and informative way to explore a life less intoxicated with no judgment or expectation. Check out the link in the description or find me at lownodrinkermagazine.com.
Mm-hmm. And also I think you also need to put the red flag into perspective because, one thing that Curtis and I really struggled with in the beginning of our relationship was video games and how he liked to play video games. Now, his playing video games was a red flag for me, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing, right? I mean, his video game interest wasn't unhealthy, right? Or it wasn't necessarily problematic. It's just a red flag for me because I really didn't like video games and video games really bothered me. Now, we've been able to work past that, but it created some serious friction. And so, I think it's just a good idea or something to be mindful of that, red flags, there's going to be something in a relationship that is going to bother you. And yes, you need to talk about it, but, you have to decide early on, is this something that we can work through, or is this just going to be too big of a hindrance in the relationship?
Right. So if someone's out there and they have a partner who plays video games and they don't like them, you cannot expect the other person to give that up.
Yeah.
That is a big mistake. I think you can talk about it and maybe talk about expectations around, say, how much time or when, things like that. That's pretty reasonable. And so I guess what you would say is you take the red flag, and then if you want to stay in the relationship, you learn how to manage it.
Yeah. Yep.
But don't ignore it. Don't ignore it. But you can manage it.
Yeah. I mean, because, some other things is if, I don't know, maybe some other things that maybe you couldn't cope with is if they have a hobby that you really hate, right? Like maybe they are really into
tap dancing.
Yeah. And you
don't like tap dancing.
And you can't stand tap dancing. The sound of tap dancing drives you absolutely crazy. Is that something that you can live with and accept?
Well, I think you'd have to manage it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to mention it because it's applicable and it matters in a relationship. And
Yeah,
that's Robin Smith's Lies at the Altars,
yeah.
the 276 questions to ask before you get married. Those are great. That's a great way to tease out the red flags. That is the
Right, and I think it also helps you figure out which ones you can manage or not.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because you can't find, the perfect person.
no,
And I think another thing too, in terms of just compatibility and what can make somebody compatible is, or something that at least is very important. And this is again ties back to Robin Smith's Lies at the Altar, all of these questions is, do you have the same life goals?
right. And I think that's a little bit different. To me, that's different
Okay.
than compatibility issues because I think you have to be pretty well aligned. I mean, if you think of life goals, for instance, working, how long you're going to work, do you save, do you not save, what do you want to do for retirement? I think that you have to be really careful about life goals because I think it works better if you're on the same page.
Yes.
Now, I think it is important to have life goals similar. I'm just thinking of the couples that I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I was thinking about religion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I would put that in the same category of life goals. I think you can have different religious views,
Mm-hmm.
but I think you need to accept the other person and you need to
Yes.
go into it accepting the other person. And as I said before, you should not try to change them. And if you go into it
No.
thinking I can change this person, that is a huge mistake. And so religion's slightly different, but I think you've got to be on the same page with financial goals. I
Yeah.
think that's a
Yeah.
big one
Yeah.
for people. You know, if you want to have a successful long-term relationship, that actually means you're going to work through the lifespan and and then figure out what are you going to do in retirement. That's a financial issue, so you've
Mm-hmm.
got to be on the same page.
Right. And so, I've shared before just how quickly mine and Curtis's relationship went. We met and married in less than a year.
Hmm.
And, and I was 19 at the time when we got married, and a lot of people really questioned my decision. And to be honest, I understand why they did. I can't say I blame them, marrying a guy I'd known less than a year at 19. But one of the things that I think really worked for us is, again, we wanted the same things, right?
Right.
I mean, we had a
Yeah.
good relationship, we had that strong connection, and we knew we wanted the same things, and primarily we both wanted somebody who made religion the center of their lives,
Hmm. Right.
right? And
Yeah.
then we also knew that we both wanted kids. We wanted me to be a stay-at-home mom. We wanted him to work full time. And so we had all those things kind of working for us. And then another thing too is I think we just decided early on there's no easy way out of this. Like even if things get rocky and even if things get tough, we're not just going to call it quits because it gets hard. And that kind of seems obvious in the beginning, like that kind of seems inevitable because otherwise why are you getting married? But I wonder
Hmm.
how many couples actually talk about that in the beginning and how many couples discuss, what are we going to do if things get hard? What are we going to do if we have unhappiness in our marriage or if we
What?
find out we're not compatible or
Yeah,
as compatible as we thought?
I don't think couples talk about it enough because, you know, in the beginning, everything's rosy, everything's great. You've got that
Yeah.
passion, and you think you're always going to be in love, and that passion on that same level, and
Mm-hmm.
it changes through the
Yeah.
lifespan. So
Yep.
talking about it is important, but you know what you're really talking about is commitment,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
you know, to have the commitment, we are committed to working through the issues that will inevitably come, as
Yeah.
they do in any long-term relationship.
Yeah. So, all right, final question to wrap up. Do you think compatibility can change? So, do you think a couple can
Yeah.
start out compatible and then just grow apart and no longer be compatible? Or do you
Well,
think that's just a matter of commitment?
yeah, I think it's a matter of commitment, and you know, we're dynamic through the lifespan, and we ought to
Mm-hmm.
expect that. Meaning
Yeah.
that if you get married at 19,
Mm-hmm.
when you're 59, you're not going to be the same person.
Yep.
And if we expect that, you know, that's an error. And so I think the commitment, for me, that says we change together and we accept the changes. Now, certainly I would acknowledge that if you decided to go and have an open marriage, something like that, there are certainly some changes that might happen that, you say, I can't live with that.
Yeah.
But most of the time that doesn't happen.
Sure.
And so I would say, looking at my own marriage of 47 years, Lindy and I are very different than, we got married. I was 21, she was 20, so very young as well. And we're 68 now. And so we are not the same people, but we have allowed each other to change and really, I think, change together. And so we never left either one of us behind. We're on the same page. I mean, when you go back to God's goals, at this point in our life, the main goals in our life first were always our kids. And now it's that our kids are grown. We're really focused on our grandchildren, and we're both that way. And so we have the same priorities still.
Yeah.
Even though we've changed in many ways, we have very much the same priority.
Yeah. So opposites can attract, but they don't have to attract. And
they don't have to.
Commitment matters way more.
Yes. Yep. And your ability to accept each other for who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it can make life very interesting if you marry somebody who has, things that are different, or somebody who gets you out of your comfort zone. I think that can make for an exciting relationship, but you have to think of it long term, right? Is long term, do I really want to be with somebody is this something I want to keep doing with long term, right? I mean,
right.
Because I would say there could be an instance where, maybe an introvert is marrying an extrovert and it's just too much for them. They can't handle it. And, the relationship kind of fizzles out because they're like, I just can't handle all of this socializing that you like to do. It's too much for me. I need somebody who's, so I mean, anything can happen. And really it has to do with commitment and acceptance.
Right. So I'll end with another one of my favorite Harlow Hendricks quotes. One of the primary tasks of marriage or long-term relationships is to learn to be comfortable with difference.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't marry yourself. You actually marry someone else.
Yeah.
So,
yep. And that's important to accept.
Yep.
Okay. So next week, we are going to continue based kind of off of our episode from 2 weeks ago. We're going to talk about passive aggressive.
I think those are terms that are misunderstood. So we're going to try and shed some light on what that actually means.
Yes, what it means to be passive aggressive. And Frankie and Jess, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but you had it wrong on the radio.
Right.
And we'll get into that. Oh, and speaking of the Frankie and Jess podcast, Mark is going to be on the Frankie and Jess podcast
in a couple
again.
Of days.
Yeah.
So next week maybe.
So sometime in the next few weeks, Mark should be on that episode. Oh, I also have really exciting news that I just remembered. We're on YouTube.
Oh, well, that's great.
We are, yes. Now it's just the audio. So I know I said I was going to try to get a visualization of a YouTube episode. I haven't figured it out because I'm not good at video editing. And to be honest, it sounds tedious.
Yeah, well, it probably is.
Yeah.
It probably is tedious.
I can't promise you that the latest episodes are available on YouTube because, well, YouTube's weird, but you can go back and listen to some of our episodes on YouTube if you are interested in that. So,
great.
Next week I already did that. Never mind.
Okay. Have a good week. Have a good week, everyone.
Liz is going to go to bed. Good night, all.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye, guys. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.